Ready to jump into something a little different? Today, we're doing a deep dive into a single interview with, well, no one other than former President Donald Trump.
It
So
is.
this isn't like a normal interview, all polished and edited.
Right.
Think more of a really long, casual conversation full of tangents and, unguarded moments.
So, like, we get to hear the real Trump.
Exactly. And honestly, you'll be surprised at the range of topics he covers.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Everything, really.
Right.
From his first time in the White House to his perspective on, international relations. It's a wild ride, really.
I bet.
We even get to hear about his reaction to the Lincoln bedroom,
Hmm.
which is not what you'd expect at all.
Very interesting.
So let's get into it.
Okay.
The interview starts with Trump talking about Inauguration Day, driving down Pennsylvania Avenue, and then he, spontaneously decides to get out and walk.
Huh. Interesting, given all the security surrounding a president.
I know, right?
It's like a conflict, almost.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have Trump, who, wants to be seen as a man of the people, wants to connect with the crowds.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, he is the president, with all the security that comes with that.
Right.
It's almost like he's trying to be the everyman, but also the president at the same time.
Exactly. And then he talks about getting to the White House, and he's, genuinely surprised at how beautiful it is inside.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, he comes from a world of, very, utilitarian spaces, skyscrapers, and boardroom.
And then he steps into this historic building.
Right. And he's especially blown away by the Lincoln bedroom.
Yeah, you can practically hear the awe in his voice when he describes it.
And he goes into these details about the bed, how it's elongated, and the chairs, how they're low to the ground.
Yeah, and then he connects that to Lincoln's sadness.
Yeah, he talks about Lincoln's melancholy, and the loss of his son Tad, and even the Gettysburg Address.
Wow, I didn't expect that.
It's a pretty unexpected connection, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it suggests that Trump, despite, his persona, actually has some depth to him.
Yeah, he's really thinking about the weight of history here and the responsibility of suddenly becoming president.
I see.
And he keeps coming back to this word surreal,
Yeah.
Like the whole experience of becoming president felt surreal to him.
Makes sense.
Like he was an outsider who was just, I don't know, thrust into the presidency.
Right. It's a recurring theme.
Exactly. It's core to his narrative. Right?
Totally. He's the political outsider challenging the establishment.
Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about all the challenges of actually governing.
Like what?
Well, specifically, he mentions the sheer number of appointments a president has to make.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard it's a lot.
He says there are 10,000 appointments.
10,000.
Yep. Can you imagine?
That's insane.
From cabinet positions to, I don't know, lower level roles, it's a huge network of positions that the president is responsible for filling.
Wow. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, especially for someone with zero governing experience.
Exactly. And he does admit that, he had to rely on recommendations from a lot of people.
Yeah, even people he campaigned against.
Huh.
He even tells the story about being advised not to appoint John Bolton.
Oh, interesting.
It really makes you wonder how he made decisions.
Right. Was he more influenced by his advisors, or did he go with his gut?
Exactly. It's a good question to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this interview.
Okay.
Later on, he does reflect on his time as president, talking about his successes.
Like what?
Well, he highlights the economy, tax cuts, rebuilding the military.
Mm-hmm.
He seems pretty proud of those achievements.
Yeah, makes sense.
But he also admits that he made mistakes,
Oh, like what?
specifically in choosing certain people for certain positions.
Interesting.
He uses some pretty strong language.
Really?
Yeah, he calls some of his appointees neocons, bad people, even disloyal people.
Well, that's harsh.
It's clear he's still thinking about those decisions and how they impacted his presidency.
Right. Those choices have weight.
And then there's his analysis of John Bolton's personality.
Oh, yeah. What does he say?
He calls him a nut job. But then, in the same breath, he says that it was good to have Bolton by his side.
Strategically, you mean?
Exactly, like it made other world leaders take him more seriously.
Yeah, like they were afraid of what Bolton might do.
Right. And then this ties into something else he talks about, which is the media and how they portray him.
Okay.
He thinks they focus too much on his, what he calls, wild statements.
No, I can see that.
He believes it actually makes him more popular.
Interesting.
Like the media is unintentionally helping him by making him seem more controversial.
Right, because it gets people talking.
Exactly. He contrasts his own style, what he calls the weave, with the very prepared and polished language that, typical politicians use.
Yeah, like he's the authentic one, even when he's being outrageous.
Right, and he gives this very specific
And
example.
what is it?
The Time 60 Minutes, you know the show.
Uh-huh.
He claims they edited Kamala Harris's answer deceptively.
Really?
Yeah, he says it was basically election interference, maybe even fraud.
Wow. Strong words.
It shows just how much he distrusts the mainstream media.
Yeah, he sees them as biased against him no matter what he does.
And it's not just the media he sees as the threat. He also talks about the actual dangers of being president.
Okay.
He brings up, get this, 2 assassination attempts that were made against him.
Wow.
And he says that the news barely even covered them.
Really?
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling reminder of the risks that come with being president.
Especially someone as polarizing as Trump.
Yeah, he clearly believes he was targeted because of his politics.
Right.
Then he tells this anecdote about Whoopi Goldberg to illustrate his point about media bias. He talks about how her views on him have completely changed since he became president.
Like she turned on him.
Exactly. He sees this as part of a larger pattern. Like, people were friendly or supportive before he got into politics, but once he became president, they turned against him.
Interesting point.
And on that note, I think we should move on to the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
Next up, we'll take a look at what Trump had to say about the economy.
Looking forward to it. Okay, so Trump jumps right into economic issues.
He does.
Specifically, his approach to taxes and tariffs.
Right.
He claims that his tax kits and tariffs, although they, increase the deficit at first,
Yeah.
were actually designed to eventually pay off the national debt.
It's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it's sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, some economists think he's right, some don't.
It definitely challenges the conventional way of thinking.
He even mentions these pollsters, McLaughlin and Fabrizio,
Oh, yeah.
saying they believe that even Washington and Lincoln couldn't have beat him in an election if it wasn't for COVID.
Right. He keeps coming back to the pandemic as this, major disruption to his economic agenda.
Exactly. He seems to think that without COVID, things would have kept going great.
Like it threw a wrench in everything.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He argues that cutting regulations actually helped businesses more than his tax cuts did.
Huh. That's counterintuitive.
I know, right? You'd think businesses would be all about lower taxes.
Makes sense, though. I mean, he is a businessman.
Yeah, and he's always been skeptical of government intervention.
Sees it as a hindrance, right?
Exactly. And get this. He calls tariffs the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
Ah.
He even talks about replacing income taxes with tariffs entirely.
Whoa. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, but it really shows you how he thinks about economics.
He's very protectionist.
Absolutely, America first.
And then he moves on to environmental issues.
Which is interesting because we see some conflicting views there.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, on the one hand, he's skeptical of some environmental regulations.
But he also says he wants clean air and water.
Exactly. It's kind of a tricky balance.
Yeah. It is. I mean, he doesn't fit neatly into the traditional categories.
Not at all. And he is especially critical of China's environmental practices.
Yeah, he says the U.S. is doing way more than its fair share.
Right. It's a common theme for him.
Unfair trade practices.
Exactly. And then he tells this story about California's water shortage.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and how Governor Newsom wouldn't sign off on some water infrastructure improvements.
What does he think about that?
He thinks it was a political move.
To, undermine him.
Yeah, and this kind of shows how he views politics.
Oh, very personal.
Everything's like a personal attack.
Interesting.
And then he starts talking about nuclear power.
As a good thing.
Yeah, he sees it as a clean energy source.
Huh.
He even brings up his uncle, Dr. John Trump.
Wasn't he a scientist?
Yeah, he was an early pioneer in nuclear technology.
It's like a family connection to nuclear power.
Right, and it shows that Trump is willing to consider solutions that other people might find controversial.
Okay, so from energy, he jumps to military and foreign policy.
Yep, big shift.
What does he have to say about that?
Well, he starts by criticizing the military leadership.
Really?
Yeah, he says he felt like he had to work around a flawed system.
That outsider perspective again.
Exactly, like even within the government, he felt like he was fighting against the establishment.
Interesting.
He tells this amazing story about a secret trip he took to Iraq.
What?
Yeah, he says he went to meet with the real generals.
So not the ones he was working with in Washington.
Right, and he describes it like it was a covert operation.
Oh, wow.
Flying with the lights off, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds intense.
And he says that his top priority was defeating ISIS.
Okay.
He really contrasts this with Biden's handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Which he obviously doesn't approve of.
Not at all. He focuses on the equipment that was left behind and the fact that the soldiers were evacuated first.
It's like he sees it as a sign of weakness.
Yeah, he thinks Biden emboldened America's enemies.
By not showing strength.
Right. He claims he had peace with the Taliban for 18 months.
Really?
Yeah, and he's frustrated that General Milley advised him to leave the equipment behind because of the cost.
So he thinks they should have just left it there.
Basically, he thinks it would have been a better show of force.
Interesting.
And then he talks about the war in Ukraine.
Oh.
He says it wouldn't have happened if he was still president.
Does he say why?
Well, he hints at a strategy that involved keeping oil prices low
Okay.
and talking directly to Putin. It's like he thinks he had some leverage over Putin that Biden doesn't.
And then he compares Ukraine to Taiwan.
Yeah, he says that China is watching what's happening in Ukraine
Yes.
and that they're thinking about making a move on Taiwan.
And he thinks he could have prevented that.
He does. He says that under his leadership, America was strong and respected.
So other countries wouldn't have dared to challenge him.
Right, and he tells this story about France.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he says he forced Macron to drop a tax on American companies
How did he do that?
by threatening tariffs on French wine and champagne.
Wow, hardball tactics.
It shows that he's willing to use economic power to get what he wants.
And then he suddenly switches gears.
Back to domestic politics.
The 2020 election.
Yep, he brings up the election again, and he repeats his claims that it was stolen.
Which, of course, have been disputed.
Right, but he clearly still believes it.
He does?
He talks about mail-in ballots and voting machines and how he thinks they're vulnerable to fraud.
It's a theme we've seen before.
Definitely distrust of the system.
And it even brings up Elon Musk.
Yeah, he mentions Musk saying that paper ballots are the only way to have fair elections.
Interesting.
He's using Musk's credibility to support his own argument.
Smart move.
He then goes on to talk about what he would do if he gets elected again.
Okay.
He says his top priorities would be ensuring fair elections
Of course.
and securing the border.
Classic Trump.
And then, out of nowhere, he starts talking about health care.
Huh.
He mentions a chart that shows the U.S. has a low life expectancy.
Despite spending so much on healthcare.
Right, and this ties into his whole narrative about America being in decline.
Like, even our healthcare system is failing.
Yeah, and then he brings up Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he hints that RFK Jr. might have a role in his administration if he gets elected.
But RFK Jr. is very controversial,
He is, especially his views on vaccines.
which Trump used to be very supportive of.
I know, it's a strange turn.
Maybe he sees RFK Jr. as someone who can appeal to people who are skeptical of vaccines.
Possibly. It could be a way to broaden his base.
It could be.
And he talks about pushback from Big Pharma.
Regarding RFK Jr.
Yeah, he says they're trying to silence him.
It's like that classic populist theme.
Totally. Corporations versus the people.
And RFK Jr. is already very critical of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, so they fit together well.
It's amazing how Trump connects all these things together.
I know, it's like a tapestry of grievances.
Election fraud, border security, healthcare, corporate greed.
It's all part of the same story.
A story about a broken system.
And Trump is the only one who can fix it.
It's a powerful narrative.
It is, and whether you believe it or not, you have to admit it's effective.
He knows how to tap into people's emotions.
Absolutely. He's a master storyteller.
So as we move into the last part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
let's keep in mind that we're not just analyzing Trump's words.
Right.
We're trying to understand the people who support him.
Why they believe what they believe.
Exactly, because by understanding Trump, we can understand America better.
Its divisions, its hopes, its fears.
It's all connected.
It's incredible, really, how much ground we've covered in this conversation with Trump.
I know, from his first days in the White House all the way to his thoughts on, well, everything, really. Nuclear weapons to social media and everything in between.
It's been a wild ride, for sure.
Yeah, and throughout it all, there's this one constant theme.
What's that?
Trump's belief that America is, in decline, that the system's rigged against the people, and that he's the only one who can fix it.
And that message seems to resonate with a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at his support. It's still strong.
So, picking up where we left off, Trump gets into education.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he criticizes what he sees as a, liberal bias in schools and universities.
That's a common critique from conservatives, right?
It is. They're worried that schools are pushing a left-wing agenda.
Instead of just teaching kids, the basics.
Exactly. Trump thinks schools should focus more on American history and values.
Okay.
And he thinks parents should have more control over what their kids are learning.
Which aligns with his whole emphasis on patriotism, right?
Totally. And traditional values.
And this distrust of, like, elitist institutions.
Yeah, like he thinks schools and universities are out of touch with everyday Americans.
Right. And from education, he moves on to energy.
He does. He's all about American energy independence.
And he's not a fan of Biden's policies
Not at all. He thinks they're hurting the economy.
by, like, trying to move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah, he says it's driving up energy costs and making America reliant on other countries,
He much prefers his own approach
which was all about boosting oil and gas production here in the U.S.
and rolling back environmental regulations.
Right. It all comes back to that idea of American exceptionalism.
Like, we can do it all ourselves.
Exactly. And then, of course, he talks about China.
He always does,
He sees them as America's biggest rival.
economically and militarily.
Both. He accuses them of unfair trade practices, stealing intellectual property.
Basically, he thinks China's been taking advantage of the U.S.
For years, he says he used tariffs to try to force them to change their behavior.
And he thinks Biden should be tougher on them.
Way tougher. He doesn't think Biden is doing enough to protect American jobs and businesses.
It's that protectionist mindset again.
Yep, America first.
He also worries about China's military getting stronger.
Yeah, he says they're catching up to the U.S.
And he sees that as a threat?
A huge threat. He thinks America needs to project strength to keep China in check.
Okay, so from China, he circles back to himself,
To his own presidency.
talking about his accomplishments.
Right. And how he thinks he was treated unfairly by the media.
And by his political opponents.
Yeah, he brings up the 2020 election again.
Oh boy, here we go.
He's still convinced it was stolen from him.
Despite all the evidence to the contrary.
He doesn't care about the evidence. He believes what he believes.
And he talks about the investigations into his business dealings.
And January 6th.
He dismisses them all as politically motivated.
Witch hunts, he calls them.
It's all part of that narrative of him being the victim.
The outsider who's being persecuted by the establishment.
Right, and he ends the interview on a defiant note.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he
In
says he's going to keep fighting for the American people.
And he hints at running for president again in 2024.
Which wouldn't be a surprise.
So what do you think? What have we learned from this deep dive into Trump's mind?
Well, I think we've seen just how deep the distrust in the system runs.
Yeah, there's this feeling that the government, the media, the elites, they've all failed the people.
And people are angry, they're frustrated, they want change.
And Trump is tapping into that anger and frustration.
He's giving them a voice, he's telling them their feelings are valid.
And he's promising to fight for them.
Whether he can actually deliver on those promises is another question.
It is, but for his supporters, the promise is enough.
They believe in him, they believe in his vision of America.
And that's what makes him so powerful.
He's a symbol of hope for people who feel like they've been left behind.
This deep dive has been a fascinating look at Trump, his worldview, and the forces that are shaping American politics today.
It's given us a lot to think about.
It has. And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring, to keep questioning, to keep diving deep.
Because there's always more to learn.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.